Okay, my name is Sam Goetz, and I was 11 years old when the war broke out. And I was born in a city called Tarnów in southern Poland. And the first few years of my life, which were from 1928 to this day when the war broke out, consisted of a life in a middle-class Jewish family, a secure home. I have had one brother who was the other member of the family, and my parents, then uncles, aunts, grandparents, and so on. The initial life, as far as I remember, was secure, and I attended a parochial Hebrew school up to the age of 11, and then it all started. And here I would like to relate to you actually what happened to me from that period of time, and for a moment I'll share with you the feelings that I have, why it's so necessary and so important to share these experiences with you, even though they are very, very painful to express, to share with you and others, but they are necessary to relate. The first 10 years after the war, I was really unable, or I didn't feel the necessity to relate what happened. There were very few questions asked, except maybe occasionally in school, in a classroom, somebody would say, "Hey, you have an accent. Where did you live during the war? Where were you during the war?" And I would say I was in German concentration camp, and that would be the end of the conversation. As time moved on in the early 60s, a greater feeling or feeling of a sensation of sharing these events or this experience came about. Maybe it was part of growing up, maybe it was part of the fact that I had children that were of the age where they would ask questions. And when I was probably 31 or 32, I felt the need to share that feeling with other fellow survivors. And just so happened that I was active in an organization, and I asked our board members of the organization one day, why don't we do something to commemorate this terrible tragedy? Let's at least donate some money to have a collection of books on the Holocaust period written after the war and the experiences written by some survivors and so on. And this was agreed upon, and then we established a fund, and we established a fund for the library at UCLA. It was $10,000 foundation, and we started to collect, and UCLA started to collect this sort of archival legacy on the Holocaust. As we moved on into the 70s, what happened to me personally was that I was very, very upset reading that the Holocaust did not occur, that this was a fake, these are a bunch of lies, and I was reading about it in the press as well as at the UCLA daily newspaper. The Daily Bruin had debate between students, and I was very upset, emotionally upset. I said, how can these young people today assume that this tragedy didn't happen? I mean, I felt there was a sense of frustration, tremendous frustration.
Was it anger too?
And anger, yes. And this, at that moment, I felt, again, something must be done. If we survive, there must be meaning to our survival. And this is how we began to explore the possibility to endow a living legacy, a chair, a professorship that will relate this to these young people, to know that what happened to us shall never happen again. And this sort of was an evolution where suddenly an explosion of feelings by survivors of what happened to them took place. This was the period when the series on TV occurred, and all of a sudden much greater interest in the Holocaust period and in survivors' experiences came about by the community here and otherwise. And this essentially led to what it's taking place this very morning, the videotaping and relating of these experiences for what we hope is posterity. Now, with this brief background, let me take you back to the year of 1939, to a medium-sized town in Poland where I was born and where I encountered first the Nazi troops and what happened to me and the change in my life. The initial impact on me in September of 1939 was the fact that I could not attend school. The previous war suddenly collapsed. As a Jewish child, I was told that obviously there would be no school for me. I was going to enter a high school right then. And my parents were faced with the dilemma, how do you educate, what do you do to a youngster who is 11 years old? Well, as I recall, my parents and other parents got together and they simply said, let's hire some former teachers and try to give these children some education. So we would have maybe every day a few hours with these teachers who will come and teach us basic algebra, geography, and whatever was taught on that level and so on. Now, this occurred in the first few months of the occupation by the German troops. The first personal encounter that I had with the Nazis was sometimes in November of 1939, and I can describe it vividly to you. We were sitting at home late in the evening, myself and my parents and a friend of mine. Suddenly there was this very, very loud noise and banging on the door of our apartment. This was an apartment house where about 6 families lived. And I vividly recall the words, Juden raus, get out Jews, and so on. Next thing I know, the door opened. I don't know whether my mother opened or my father, and there was this bunch of civilians who had armbands with swastika armbands on their arms. There were civilians, and they were screaming and shouting and so on. They said, "Get out," in German, from our apartment.
These are Polish civilians?
No, they were German Nazi civilians who had actually swastika bands, armbands, which was quite common at that time because some of them were administrators who came into the occupied part of Poland. We were gathered in the courthouse of the apartment, and I recall that one of them put a revolver against my temple, and this was the first sensation, the feeling of a cold steel against my face that I have had at that time, and that I recall to some extent.
What was your feeling?
No fear at that time. I guess I tried to recapture that feeling. There was no fear. It was sort of a strange feeling. Now, on the horizon, this was in the evening, you could see flames. And it was a little later, about an hour later. Now, we were all assembled there in the courthouse, and we were just basically told to get out. My parents and I went to my uncle's house that was maybe a mile away, and there where we spent the night. It was next morning that we found out that the main synagogue in town was dynamited and burned, blown up and burned. In retrospect, today, I know that this was the first anniversary of the Kristallnacht, But this was, remember now, this was in Poland, which was just occupied, Tarnów occupied by the Nazis. This was 3 months in occupation, or 2.5 months. So this was the first, and this is how they celebrated the anniversary of the Kristallnacht. And this was my first direct encounter. Up to the first 3 months, basically, I was more or less sheltered. Now, what I recall, the next few things that happened to me and to my family and to my friends was that we were told to wear armbands with a Magen David, a Star of David. You know, you had to be identified, and you, I believe it was something like 4 inches wide. It was on the arm, on the right arm, and everyone over the age of 6 had to wear these, otherwise you could be punished.
Can you recall, thinking back, what your response was to first not going to school, and
the fact
thrown out, and then the synagogue being burned?
I can't really get the feelings, the intensity of the feelings. I try to think about it often, but how I felt about it then. I was 11 years old. I'm sure that I was upset, but I can't recapture that. The feeling of wearing an armband bothered me because it was visible at night and otherwise, and I felt that I was targeted. You know, I felt certain feeling of insecurity started to creep into my personal life, and I was upset about it. The next event that stands out in my mind, which probably made some impact on me, but it made right then, but whether it left any, I don't recall. I was walking home with my father one day, and this was still in the early beginning of occupation, which was late 39. And it was very, very short, just before the curfew. Curfew was imposed, like after 7 o'clock in the evening, you could not be found on the street. You could be shot. You know, these were decrees which were posted throughout the city. And I was walking home from my grandmother's house with my father to our own house. It was something like maybe a mile away. There were no people on the street. It must have been 5 minutes before the curfew. And suddenly, on the corner of the street that we were crossing, there was a uniformed Nazi policeman standing. And he was sort of restless. I recall that vividly. He was smoking. As my father and I were approaching, he threw the cigarette away, and he readied himself to an unusual position, you know. And I recall those moments that there was a fear within me. My father must have sensed something too, because I recall in the last moment he took his hat off. And this man, with his fist drawn and so on, ready apparently to assault us, or at least my father said, "Du hast Glück, du Jude, you are lucky Jew." Apparently he was ready to beat him up. And at the last moment, the fact that he took his head off saved the situation. But this I remember vividly, and there were other things which you remember less, but apparently left some sense of, maybe sense of frustration, humility. After all, it was my father whom I looked up to, and I remember that incident. It just stands out in my mind. I try to recapture sometimes the image of that man, that Nazi, and what made him change his mind in the last moment. Why didn't he beat my father up and possibly me? The fact that I, 11-year-old boy, accompanied him, I don't know. Maybe he had a son. Maybe, I just don't know. Moving on to 1940, there were many other events that I recall vividly. One that impacted our family was the fact that my brother was separated from us.
Was he older or younger than you?
My brother was 7 years older, and on the day when the Nazi troops occupied my hometown, he left east, towards the Eastern Territories. He was a high school student at the time, and that part of Poland was divided between Soviet Union and Germany. So he lived now in the territory occupied by the Soviet Union. There was a tremendous attachment between him and my mother. He was the firstborn, and he was sickly. And I recall that, now that he and my mother had developed a very, very strong bond. My mother suffered tremendously that he was separated, and she searched for means to get him across to us. There was a underground smuggling activity from across the border between the Nazi-occupied territory and the Soviet-occupied territory. People were escaping from the Nazi territory, and some people were coming back. My mother tried very hard to get my brother over, and arrangements were made to bring him back. And I remember vividly the correspondence that was going on between him and my parents. He was in the city of Lvov actually in Polish. One day, it was early in February of 1940, a letter arrived, and my mother would send me to intercept the mailman usually, because she was so anxious to receive mail from him. And a letter arrived from my brother, which I was happily to dash home and say, "Mother, there's a letter from brother, from Benek." Well, the letter was opened, and I could see that my mother's face dropped. The letter was written 3 weeks prior to its arrival, in which my brother says, "I am going to see you very soon, in a few days." So the feeling was that something terrible happened to him. Well, as we know today, and we found out a few months later, he was caught at the border and put in jail. He was caught by the Germans, thrown across the border, jailed again by the Russians, who then deported him and sentenced him for crossing the border and so on. So at the age of 18, he was then put into Russian camp. Tremendous impact this made on our family life, because my mother started to suffer. And she almost was going periodically into a depression. You know, how this child can be living way out there in this cold, unprotected, because we knew by then where he was sent, you know. So these years were obviously very troubling to me. Between my mother and my father would often have discussions, unpleasant discussions about it.
When you were saying troubling,
well, troubling to a youngster, because I could see that my parents were unhappy about it. Mm-hmm. My mother felt that my father should have gone with him. There was a guilt that she tried to impose upon my father. He should never let him go by himself, you know. And that disturbed me too, because it disturbed my security in a way at home. So I remember that vividly. One other incident that I recall, that my mother decided, before we knew that my brother was sent into the depth of Soviet Union, we knew where he was in jail. He was on a border town called Przemyśl. So one day, it was early in 1940, my mother took her armband off and got on a train as non-Jewish to see if she could smuggle herself to the other side and possibly see my brother. And I remember the amount of anxiety, if she will ever come back and so on. And I was only 12 years old at that time. Those were difficult years, as far as I recall, for two reasons. Not only the German occupation, but I could see the discord, the problems, because of the sufferings of my parents, because of the separation, you know. There was very little that I was thinking about my own security and safety, you know. I didn't have the feeling that anything terrible was going to happen to me yet. The Nazi occupation was developing in a progressive. All that was happening was there were more restrictions. I couldn't go on certain streets. A sort of a formation of loose ghetto, but not a close, where Jews could live in certain area and so on. So it had impact, but the domestic problems, the separation, was more troubling me, as I recall today.
Did you at that sense feel that you were any less important than your older
No,
brother?
never had that feeling. But the fact that there was lack of unity at home, that these reproaches were being made, bothered me somehow. Because up to that moment, there was a very secure home, and I believe today that we're very under great stress and strain. Middle of 1940s, we were simply kicked out from our house. This was the first move which the Nazis began to implement against the Jewish population. They simply decreed that certain parts of town had to be evacuated, and they gave usually 24 to 36 hours. So living in a part of town which was non-Jewish in nature, they simply said, now this part of town has to be evacuated and you better get yourself a place. So I recall that we looked for a place and our parents were upset and so on, and I think, I don't recall the exact dates and so on, but this is less important. All I know is that all our belongings were left, and whatever we could take, a few things, and moved into a different part of town, which essentially then was more or less the Jewish sector of town, or the old Jewish part of town, and now it became sort of a loose ghetto. So we had to move out. And it was interesting, though, that the window of that new apartment faced the railroad tracks. And this will have some value in my story later on. At any rate, we moved there, and my life basically continued in that sense that the teachers would again be used to come to our house, and we would have this makeshift where sometimes I'll go to somebody else's home, and we would have these lessons, and my parents were very concerned that we should continue with the education. I mean, that was very, very important. At that time, obviously, my father could not work. His pre-war occupation was that he had a import-export business of furs. So obviously that was out. And when the war began, we had warehouses of some furs which had to be turned over to the Nazis under the penalty of death. So he was able to hide few of these furs, particularly there were sealskins, and he hid them in the attic of my grandparents' home. So during that period of time, the only way we could sustain ourselves is that every so often he would sell some of these on the black market. And we would sell some of the other possessions. You know, I recall one day that my father's gold watch, the wedding gift, was sold. And how I recall this event was that he and I would walk to this party that bought this watch. And I would walk 100 yards ahead of him. I would carry the watch. He felt that if there's anybody is caught, the Nazis would not look at me, a little kid. You know, they would look at him and so on. So he was behind me, and I remember how we delivered this watch, which was sold for money so we could sustain ourselves. So this was the activity, basically, was that we tried to sell whatever possessions we had to live. And the basic thing was, of course, bread and marmalade and some butter and occasionally an egg and so on. So there was no question of starvation in that period of time, which was, as I said, late 1940. The feeling that I could recall was that my parents wanted very badly for me to continue to get education and to just live on and hope for the best. My father's daily activities, I remember, were that he would leave home in the morning. I did not know what he was doing. But at night he would come home and relate to my mother that basically what was going during the day, they were politicking. They were looking for some form, a clue of hope that this war will end. And this was the daily activities. You would meet some other people, someplace in the Jewish thing, and walk and talk about hope of survival. There were, I mean, all the doors of leaving it by that time were closed. You know, so I live in my own world, obviously, with my friends, try to learn a little bit, whatever we could, you know, with this makeshift school. But the next event that I recall vividly that impacted me and my family was that I was walking one day to my friend's home to meet these teachers. And a German officer approached me and he said, "You come with me." And he mumbled something in German, and I couldn't understand. And but he says, "You come with me." I could understand that.
You understood some German at
Oh
the
yes,
time.
yes. I reconstructed later what he said. And I must have said something that I'm going someplace, and he said the Trooper Gate 4, which means that the importance of the work for the army is paramount. Anyway, he took me away to a barrack. And he said, "Now, you and a few others that were called along with me, so you better clean this floor here and clean these barrack latrines." You know. So I was there all day till late night cleaning. And I recall that I was very much worried, what will my parents think? I mean, what happened to me? You know. Finally, at the end, possibly 12 or 14 hours, I was released and I was told to, to go back home. So this was sort of the, again, initial additional contact. And there wasn't that much fear, but it was that more as anxiety. Well, what will my parents think? Where am I? I was 12 at that time. So. Now we are moving closer to the events which obviously were, I would say, part of this total tragedy of my family and the rest of my friends and everybody else's. 1941, I was approaching the age of 13, which would be my bar mitzvah. My parents made arrangements with a Hebrew teacher to come to the house and prepare me for the bar mitzvah. Now, the scenario was such that Jews could not congregate and could not worship. We were a fairly emancipated family as far as my parents attended synagogues before the war, usually during high holidays, but not on a weekly basis. But there was always a very strong feeling of Judaism, and since, of course, bar mitzvah, this was a must, and so on. Well, apparently, I'm sure that I was not consulted, I cannot recall, but it was a decision made by my parents to make sure that the son has bar mitzvah. Well, I don't recall how happy I was to have this Hebrew teacher come to the house and teach me and prepare me for bar mitzvah, but I recall the day of my bar mitzvah, and that stands in my mind very vividly. It was on a Saturday, and I'll relate in a moment why I remember the date, June 21st, 1941. They made a makeshift synagogue, which was in an apartment house upstairs. There was a one room, and there were a lot of people, or there may have been 2 rooms. I recall that provisions have been made to have people stand in a gate downstairs. If, God forbid, they see a Nazi uniformed police or anyone else suspicious, they should immediately send somebody up to tell that somebody is approaching, because we could have been all shot to death. This was against all rules and regulations under the Nazi regime. You could not worship, in all this room, congregation of people and so on. Well, nothing happened. I had my bar mitzvah. I had my dissertation, which I recall today, even the opening of the words. But what made a great impression on me were the gifts. To a 13-year-old, gifts still meant something in this crazy world. My family, my father had some friends, German Jews from Berlin. And I recall the book that they gave me. It was called Moses in German, which I had difficulty reading. Somebody else brought a book which was a pictorial story of the Grand Canyon in Arizona. And I recall this book very vividly, for the simple reason that I remember that Saturday afternoon I opened and looked at those pictures. And I said, God, I mean, there is this beauty someplace. And that stands out in my mind very vividly. It's something that, at any rate...
That was a contrast between danger and beauty and freedom.
It was called the unusual things of nature. I don't recall, I would have to translate it from Polish, but it was unusual because I remember the crater in Arizona and then the Grand Canyon. It was a beautiful book, And I recall that afternoon sitting, after the ceremony, sitting on the bed in our home or in our apartment and looking at those.
But you were aware of the danger.
I was aware of the danger at that time already, because the fact even that people had to watch when we were worshipping. You see, I was 13 already, so the danger and these other impacts. So the danger was there. I could already sense that, you know, that evolution of fear was gradually penetrating. Why did I remember the date so vividly? At the time of the day even, it's because next day was a day of hope. Suddenly that morning, it was Sunday, June 1941, the streetcars stopped running, and we knew something happened. I mean, there was a silence. I mean, that you walked down on the street, something was happening, and I remember what was happening. I mean, rumors, a war between Soviet Union and Germany began. And that day, there was a ray of hope to us that possibly something will happen. You know, if there's a war, maybe Germany will lose the war. I mean, up to that moment, there was nothing major happening. I mean, you know, the Nazi-controlled press, we were able to get the newspapers and so nothing was happening. And at that 41, I mean, we knew that Germany was winning the war, and Paris was occupied and all that. But there were no movements, no hope, no clues for hope. 2 days later, I recall vividly our hope, and I can recall those sensations at the time. The hope started to wane because the Nazi newspapers, there were two newspapers, a German paper called the Krakower Zeitung and a Polish newspaper, one written in German, one in Polish, which were controlled by Nazis. Tremendous headlines about the losses of the Soviet armies. Now we first thought, well, these are lies and so on. But within a week, the stores that they were occupied by Poles, not Jews, either German or Polish stores, would exhibit flags and maps of the German armies moving into the Soviet Union. And they would be moving these flags daily as the German troops were going to the depth of Soviet Union. So somehow the feeling that something good will come out of it, in that sense they will be liberated, was vanishing. And you could sense the depression in our family and in the community. So this was the period of moment of hope which suddenly vanished. Now, between this period and the 1942, where the implementation of what we know today as the final solution and the impact upon me, between those events, nothing major was happening in our hometown except of occasional arrest of the Jews in the ghetto. The arrest was done by the German criminal police. And I remember that they would be driving into the ghetto in a little car, stop with screeching brakes in front of a house, and you could hear that sound, and you would be very, very fearful, because you knew that nobody else would drive a car. And they would pick up some people and arrest them.
You were aware of this?
I was aware of that,
and
because my parents were aware of that. And we knew that these were done for either dealing with certain things which the Germans, the Nazis, considered black market, like maybe selling an item, or maybe a gold watch, so you could sustain yourself, so you could live. So I remember that vividly. Those events, the life was punctuated with these fearful events, and there was that anxiety feeling, which apparently I tried to recall today. How did I feel about it? But it was there, because I remember there was anxiety, because I had anxiety for my parents, for my father, and I knew that every so often he would have to sell, and it happened one day.
You were aware of your father's inability to stop any of this, that he was helpless.
Yes, I was aware also that he would sell these sealskins every so often. And it happened one day. A man came to our house, and I remember that my father had a few of these sealskins under the bed, hidden. And my father showed him those, and he bought some. Well, a few hours later, I remember my father coming home running. He was very upset. he found out that this man was working for the Gestapo. He was part of these people who would denounce others. Well, I recall that this fear, my mother and myself and so on, that this has to be stopped, that this man has to be stopped somehow. If otherwise, terrible thing would happen. My father would be arrested and he could have been shot. Now, this is still in 1940. This is 42, early 42. Well, immediate steps were taken. I remember my father tried to find out who knew this man in the ghetto, who has influence upon him to tell him not to denounce my father. Not to denounce.
Was he a Polish man or a Jewish
No, he was a
man?
Jewish man. Yeah. In the ghetto. We had very few of those, but there were few who did work. We knew who they were. And they usually would not last very long. They would be shot later on, and most of them were within a few months. They would collaborate for the temporary status and security, and then there would be their own security, which they thought was security, and they would be taken to the cemetery and shot by the Gestapo. We used to see them sitting in the little horse and buggy with a Gestapo agent taken to the cemetery, then some of them. At any rate, arrangements were made. Apparently, he was intercepted. He did not denounce my father. I don't recall how. But this was an event that I remember a lot of fear and so on. Well, let's move on now to the most critical period of this entire experience of my childhood. June 1942. 2 days before my birthday, my 14th birthday, there was a feeling in the ghetto, now this was still an open ghetto, that something is happening. Tremendous rumors. I remember that there was almost through osmosis as far as a youngster. I don't recall that either my parents or my friends' parents would sit down and say there's danger coming, but you could sense that. You could sense that, and I don't know exactly how. I cannot describe to you. All I remember is that 2 days before my birthday, I was walking on the street with my friends. And I was walking by what used to be a high school. It must have been midday. And suddenly a German civilian stopped us. And there must have been 3 or 4 of us. And he said, "What are you doing on the street? Where are your ID cards?" Now remember, and I didn't mention before, but we all had to have identification cards with a picture. And on the identification card it also said what was your profession. You had to state that. And he stopped us and he said, "What are you doing in the middle of the day on the street?" And he threatened us, and that was something that I remember I came home and I told my parents, we were stopping, that this man was in front of this high school and so on. And maybe that gave me some anxiety feeling. But 2 days later, which was June the 10th, there was an announcement through the Jewish Council to the population in the ghetto. We had to register. And what it meant was that we had to go to high schools and other assembly places with our ID cards and register. Well, I remember I went with my father in the morning, and there were these lines of people, and this was a high school. And there was a table, and there were many other tables. And in front of this table sat a SS man. And by then we could, of course, distinguish. Part of our curiosity as children was always to distinguish who was a member of what, SS from another part of German hierarchy, who was a Gestapo agent, who was an SS man, and so on. This man was in an SS uniform. He was sitting behind a table, and this was this line of people. And he looked at you, and he had a stamp in his hand. He looked at me. He looked at my ID card, and he stamped it on the front of this page where my picture was. And it was a round stamp, and it said, the chief of the SS and police for the district of Krakow. There were many of these tables, as I mentioned to you, and so the line moved very, very fast. And I didn't think anything of it, you know, and didn't know what it meant. As I said, there was some anxiety in the community. All these people suddenly had to appear to register. And my father got his stamp, and his was a little stamp, just a little K. So was my mother. She was also stamped. Well, she was not in the same line with me, and you know. And I went home, and that was it. Next morning, at 5 in the morning, there was a knock on the door. A man, we opened the door, a man calls my name out. The man was a Jewish policeman we referred to at the time as an Ordnungsdienst, which was the auxiliary ghetto police. Mm-hmm. He had a list in his hand, and I was on his list. And he said, "You come with me." And I obviously came with him. He said, "Take your identification card and take some things with you, and you're coming with me." And this was the day after my 14th birthday. And he took me to the Jewish council building, which was a little building in the ghetto with a large square. And by then, there were a lot of people there. There may have been hundreds of people there. He took my ID card and went upstairs, and he told me to stay there and wait. So I was. All I recall that probably by mid-noon, maybe around 11:30, I got my ID card back, and I was told to go back home, which I did. I came home, my parents embraced me. What happened? I said I was taken there, and I was told them to go. I was sitting. That afternoon, it must have been 3 hours later, a knock on the door. I opened the door. 3 SS uniformed Nazis in a full combat gear were at the door. And they asked for Samek Goetz. They had a list in their hand. I said, "Well, it's me," in German. "Where's your identification card? Where's dein Ausweis?" in German. I showed it to them. They looked at it, and they said, "Wo sind deine Eltern? Where are deine Eltern? Where are your parents?" And my father and my mother were in the back. Well, as reconstructed today was, they took my father away. They asked for his ID card, and they looked at it, and they took him away. A horse with a buggy was waiting downstairs. He was put on this horse in a buggy, and then they went to the next house and did the same thing. Reconstructing today, the story was, I was on the list because anyone under 14 and over certain age was considered by the Nazis as arbeitsunfähig, or somebody not capable to do any work. Apparently, the Jewish Council had to submit the list of these people who were under the 14 and over certain age to the Gestapo. And this list was the first used by the Einsatzgruppe, or the special squads of the SS extermination groups, to weed us out and be put to the extermination camps. And this, of course, I didn't know right then. I did not know that this stamp had that much meaning. But I was on that list, which was verified in the afternoon. Initially was by the policeman in the morning, then verified in the afternoon by the SS to make sure that all these people were rounded up. But since I had that round stamp, which apparently was a seal of life, I was left to stay, but my father was taken away. At any rate, we didn't know right then what it all meant, obviously. That the stamp meant life, at least for the day or for 2 days. At any rate, my father escaped next morning and came home. And he told us that he was taken to a high school where people were put in waiting. He was beaten that night he was placed against the wall where they were threatened to be shot. Many of the SS were drunk. But he escaped next morning to the gate. He simply took a big pot of soup that was delivered from the Jewish Council, and he took it out, and they thought he was a worker from the thing, and he just left the gate and came home. And he described to us this terrible feeling, this terrible thing. I remember he walked into the house and he said, "This was eine Gehenna, it was hell," you know, and I never forget those words. At any rate, for the next 2 days, this roundup of Jews took place, and we could hear shots, and there was no communication. We couldn't get out of the house. We didn't go out of the house. People were being rounded up.
How did your family respond to this and once your father came home?
We stayed in the house. We did not know what to do. I had a wet nurse who was a Christian, a Catholic woman, who stayed with us, but not up to that moment, but because the Jews and the Gentiles couldn't stay together at that time. But it was very dedicated to me because she was with us 14 years almost. You know, as I said, she was the wet nurse. Well, she came to the house, and my father asked her to find out what's going on. She was Christian. Obviously, she could move. Movements were not restricted. She went to the council, the Jewish council building, you know, the center of information. This was on next day. She came back, and she related the story to us, to what happened. She walked into the council building. As she came in there, she said Gestapo agents, and she thought they were drunk, came up to the building. She hid behind the desk, and she witnessed how these Gestapo agents shot the entire members of the council. And she came and she told my father's story. And she said people are just being rounded up and being shot and so on. And this, as I know today, of course, historically and otherwise, was the first deportation of Jews from the city of Tarnów to Belzec. At any rate, this lasted from this Wednesday to Monday. Sunday, my parents decided to move from this apartment to another place where there was a workshop. They thought that possibly, you see, the workshops were being set up already. And we know today historically that those of us who may have gotten the initial round stamp from the Gestapo, that the Gestapo agent thought that these people might be useful, you know, might be able to work and so on. This was the evolution in their thinking. You know, we can reconstruct it today, and this is basically what did happen. So we moved into an area where there was a workshop, and I was put into the workshop where there were some farriers working. There was a large room, there were tables, and there were furs. And my parents moved just adjacently. There was a little cellar. They walked into the cellar because we already knew that the round stamp, round on the ID card meant life and death. So I had the round stamp, so I was in the workshop. Well, on Monday, this was Monday morning, we moved into that workshop, and my parents went to the cellar. Okay, all I remember is that other people went into the cellar. And the workshop was located in such a manner that I could see the gate, the iron gate of that cellar. There were steps going down. The decision had to be made whether to padlock the door, the iron door, which basically in the past probably served as a storage warehouse in that cellar. And they decided not to put a padlock. They felt if the SS comes in there, they find a padlock, and they find the people, they'll shoot them on the spot. So they left it open, the door was slammed. Well, at any rate, around probably 11 that morning, the SS made the rounds, and they were going again from house to house searching. And they came to the place where we stayed. We were told to show our ID cards again. You have to place it on a table just like this. And the SS men, full combat gear, machine guns, helmets, and so on. We're just looking, you know, they were all in the SS uniforms. And, you know, I remember seeing one of the SS going up, brought some people down. On the way down, he looked to the right, and he saw this door. And I remember him saying, I could hear, it wasn't that far, him saying, Was ist da los? What's going on there? Who's there? And they opened this door, and they looked down, and they started to shout in German, Get out, get out. And I will never forget that. There must have been 20 people. My parents came out, and I tried to make an eye contact. Obviously, I could see my father's face. He had a trench coat on, no possessions, my mother. I couldn't see fear on his face, but it was an intense, uptight kind of look. Never made an eye contact with me. And they walked out. And somehow right then I had the feeling that this probably would be the last time that I'll see them. But this was the last glimpse that I had of my parents. And I remember what he wore. I don't recall what my mother had on. About 10 minutes afterwards, the SS moved out of this area. And there was this turmoil among us now, you know, who was taking where and how. And about half hour afterwards, I put a piece of fur on my arm, acting sort of, going from this workshop, there was another workshop, maybe half a mile. I had no fear at all, and I felt I'll go out, want to see what happened to my parents. And this piece of fur would sort of give me, legitimize that I am maybe taking a piece of thing from one place to another, as I'm working, or whatever it meant, you know. Well, I'll never forget that, because I walked on a street which was called the Lemberger Strasse, which was Lemberg, a city of Wolf in German. It was a part of the Jewish ghetto, the heart of the Jewish ghetto. And there was no fear in me, but I could see the SS beating up some bearded Jews. And at one point I saw this bearded man on the ground. He was being stepped by an SS man, hitting him with his boots, and this man was lying there, you know. It was a cold feeling in me. I don't know. I was in a shock, probably. But I wanted to know what happened to my parents, you know, and I just ran, and I ran, well, I did not know what happened. About an hour later, we were told that they're all going to the railway station. And that's exactly where they went. They were taken to the railway station, where the trains were waiting for them. And now, I'll relate a story which I mentioned initially. The windows of the apartment where we lived looked upon the railway tracks. Late that afternoon, I went back home, which we left that morning, to the workshop place. This is where I lived with my parents. As I was approaching our apartment there, I could see the railway tracks. And I could see the train. And how could I tell that this was the train? Because the SS guards were on the train. The train was moving east. See, this was a track which was right there going towards the east. And there were SS guards, of course, on the train. So I knew this was the train. And I remember that feeling. Right then, I must have gotten out of shock, because there was a tremendous feeling of being left alone. I ran into the apartment. I looked out of the window of the little which looked upon, and the train was moving very, very slow. And this was actually the last moments that I recall that.
And you were then alone?
I was alone. I went to the apartment. I didn't know who was left from the family. I don't mean my parents, but aunts, you know, whoever. I had no idea. I went and looked through the apartment to see what I should take with me to go back to the workshop. Somehow I felt maybe I'm safer there. I recall looking to the drawers of the bedroom, my parents' bedroom. And I'll never forget opening one drawer and seeing my father's passport. He was traveling before the war, being in the export-import business, with his picture. It was a Polish passport. A passport was not easy to get before the war. Somehow, this picture stands again in my mind. Opening the drawer and seeing this passport, black with a gold eagle on that. Opening it and seeing my father's picture. I don't know why that stuck into my mind. But it was that drawer, there was nothing in it except that passport. Maybe it was a symbol. Maybe it meant something. Maybe it could have meant that we could have gotten out. Maybe why we stayed there. I just don't know. But this was the last day in that place for me, the last moment that I left, took some belongings, a few of my things, and went. And actually, I went to see if my aunt, my mother's family was alive. And I walked in there, and some of them were alive. and this was the episode of actually the first deportation. There was one other thing that I did, and this is significant. Before I left, there was a Gentile family living downstairs. The man was a railroad worker. And my parents were quite friendly with him. They were from the city of Poznań, who apparently they were evacuated from that part of Poland, which was annexed to the Third Reich. And they had a little girl. My parents, I know, they were quite, on good terms with him. Since I knew that the man was working for the railroads, I asked him, where do you think this train is going? And I'll never forget that. He took a map out. There was a pre-war map of Poland. And he encircled the city of Belzec. Didn't know what it meant. I know what it means today. Because there was 600,000 people died. There's not one survivor of Belzec. So I could say that in right that moment, I knew, he knew from the other railroad people who knew where the trains were going, but who knew what Belzec meant, At any rate, this was just as a little thing.
You didn't lose your desire to then keep on going. You went out to look for your family.
I went to see my aunt and my uncle. My mother's alive. So I went to their apartment in the ghetto, and they were alive. Well, we were all sort of in a shock. Yet there was, all I can describe is that I felt very alone, very alone at that time. Well, to continue, the events in the ghetto were such that 6 weeks later, I stayed with my aunt and my uncle, and there were 2 cousins, and we were all in this apartment, and the community was in shock. Today we know that about 8,000 people were taken that time away during this first action. This action was repeated, and a few weeks later, about, I believe, 4 weeks later. And I have to describe that incident because this was, again, when people ask you how to survive, there were so many things that you don't know why you survived. Because the first time it was that stamp on my ID card, which would have meant definitely death for me if I would have not received it. No question about it. But the next incident, the second deportation action. After this first deportation, the entire community, my family, which meant my aunts, uncles, and so on, everybody was in sort of a shock. I can't really describe. I must have been in sort of a shock myself. I can't describe the details. I can, however, go to the next deportation, which was probably about 3 to 5 weeks later. By then, we were all assigned to workshops. You had to work. The ghetto was closed. Well, one day at the workplace, all our ID cards were again assembled. They were taken away from us. So we knew again that something was happening. I mean, every time something like that, you knew. The community, the feeling was that, again, the rumors were that something again is happening. Now, remember, we had no communication with other Jewish towns or other ghettos. Rumors were constantly there. I don't recall specifically what I was told or from either my aunt or my uncle or my cousins, but you could just sense that something was happening. Anyway, my ID card was taken away from me. I recall that, I don't remember the dates, but it was an evening where the ghetto was closed. And these ID cards were being returned to our apartments, the rooms that we now lived. ID cards had the address. Not like the first time where they were stamped and then given to you right away. But the Ordnungsteam, the Jewish auxiliary police, would deliver them. So I remember that night, all night, people would be coming up from the Jewish Council, the police, auxiliary police, and shouting, screaming, saying, does Joe Doe live here, and so on. I mean, does so-and-so live here, and so on. And they would carry these ID cards. Well, we were waiting all night. I was waiting till about 3 at night, and I was desperate because I knew if my name, if my ID card is not delivered, by then I knew that I am doomed. It was a feeling of desperation. I remember that vividly. And there were 2 other people staying in the room, sharing with me the room, and I recall that one of the men was called out and his ID card was given to him. And there I looked, and it was stamped. It had a same stamp that was given to me before, but it was in green ink this time. Again, the chief of the police and the SS, in the same place, you know. By 3 at night, I became very desperate, and I thought, well, if they don't deliver it anymore, well, I'm doomed, you know. The ghetto was closed, surrounded by the SS. You could look out of the window and you could see the guards of the SS. I left that little room, making my way to the Jewish Council's building, a little wooden building, 2-story in the center of the ghetto. It was dark. I moved up the stairs. There was no one there, absolutely no one. On the steps going up, there were hundreds of these pink ID cards there, you know, just thrown up, just scattered. I walked up into the main room, which it said the president of the Jewish Council, and look there, I see an empty table, cards all over, and I said to myself, what is going on? Where is everybody? Middle of the night. I was desperate. I thought right then I have to do something. Either try to find a place to hide, or I guess I would just, there was a feeling already that death was happening, you know, that people were being killed, that this transport that went my parents, that nobody had written, nobody was communicated with anybody else. So we didn't know specifically, I didn't know specifically what happened to my parents, but you felt the sense of doom. You just sensed it. As I was walking down the steps, I picked up an ID card. And I look at it, and it has a green stamp, chief of police of the Gestapo, SS and police. But it's crossed out with a pen. But it's there. There's a picture, somebody's picture, a young person's. At that moment I felt I have gained life again. This was my passport. This was life was given to me. I felt no matter what, it's that green little piece of stick that gives me life. As I looked out of the window coming down, I see the SS police entering the ghetto. The gate open, they came, which be the next selection. Well, now my mind was working very fast. How do I get this ink out, which crossed this thing out? I said, you know, and I started to rub it and so on. It actually was done with a lead pencil, which you had to moisten in Europe to kind of, you know, and it was not easy to remove it. But I thought, my God, I have at least this piece of thing. I didn't have any ID card. At any rate, I made my way out, and the SS came in, and screams and shouts, Ali Yuden Raus, and people were moved into the square, which used to be an old depot before, bus depot. And there were screams saying, everybody who has an ID card with the seal, line up to this side, and those who don't, line up there. And this was 6 in the morning. By then, you could see the light and so on. And anyway, I lined up with those who had the ID card with a stamp on it. And anyway, for the rest of the day, we were sitting on this square, and people were brought in from the homes, and the SS and the Gestapo were searching and getting people out from the basements and attics, and children and women were brought to the square. And in this square, selection took place. All those who didn't have, again, the stamp were taken away. And all those of us who had, we were sitting there till about 7 at night. And at that time, each of us, in a single row, had to hold up this card like this, and there was this SS and Gestapo agent standing and to look at it. By then, as I said, the others who didn't have it were taken away. How many thousands, I cannot tell, but historically today I know that there were probably 6,000. This is what the records taken away on the trains again to Belzec. Okay, I lined up with the rest of them. I tried to rub this thing off, but I figured, my God, you know, I'll just hold it. I mean, the picture was now. And I went through that line. and they looked at it. And this is how I was saved. When people ask me, how did you survive and what made you survive, when you relate this incident, that there were thousands possibly of these ID cards, and that I picked up one that, I cannot answer. What made me just pick up this one? Suppose I would have picked up another one that didn't, because probably most of them didn't have any. This is why they were thrown away. Okay, the ghetto was closed. Then the next day we were marched off to the workplace again, to the work area, and my family, the rest of my family was taken away. There was basically no one left. All the cousins, uncles, my mother's. I mean, there was just no one left from my family. That night, I recall, I slept on the floor. There were some other people. There was sort of a euphoria that we survived. Again, we were in a shock, because people were looking for their relatives. Before I went to work next morning, I still remember that I looked for some friends of mine to see if they survived. So we went to the place where I knew they lived, and I walked into the place, and I will never forget the picture. It looked like a battlefield. The pots and pans on the floor, the beds, the bedding, everything. It was a horrible picture, just like a thunder would have struck that. And apparently the SS and so on, they just looked through and they left nothing unmoved. It was a horrible picture of destruction in this apartment. Everything was in such a, turmoil. Anyway, there was no one there. These friends that I was looking for, my former classmates and so on, they were all gone. I mean, everyone was gone. Anyway, basically, this was the end of that episode of my life up to that point. And 6 weeks later, I escaped from the ghetto. I made contact with my wet nurse, who was a Catholic thing. She gave me the papers of her son, who was born the same time as I. This is how she happened to be my wet nurse, She gave me papers, and I escaped. She made arrangements for me to stay with a Christian woman. And I stayed there for 6 weeks. In the meantime, another action took place in the ghetto. Third deportation, as she told me, because I didn't know about it. She told me that the ghetto was surrounded again. And I lived at that time with this woman who had a little child, and I was basically in one room, just did nothing but stay with her.
Where was that?
It was in Tarnów.
Oh,
On the Christian side, out of the ghetto. I just, left it with a gate and so on. However, I decided to return back to the ghetto. After that last deportation, my my witness told me, she says, now the ghetto is not surrounded anymore. They took again some people and so on. I felt I cannot stay there. It was a terrible condition, in a little room. Her neighbors did not know that I'm hidden there. It was a fear, terrible feeling of isolation. And so I said, well, let me go back. I just can't be here. So I returned to the ghetto. And I went back to work in the workshop where I did. The ghetto conditions tightened. The ghetto was converted into a camp with the SS supervising. And basically it just became a smaller place because in physical structure, because so many people were deported, and there were very difficult conditions and so on, some more starvation and so on. But a few months later, the ghetto was liquidated. Again, it was surrounded. The SS came, surrounded it. We were again on the same square. Some of us were told to go into one direction, others were told into the other direction. I went to the railway station under the SS guards, boarded a train, and was transported to a concentration camp. The first concentration camp. And to describe how I entered that, and I thought it was a madhouse again. It was Krakow, Prussia, first concentration camp. We arrived in the middle of the night, after probably going by train for 6-7 hours. It's a 1-hour train trip. I remember vividly the illuminated area, the towers and the barbed wires, and I thought, is this an insane asylum? I was a strange impression on a 15-year-old at the time. Very harsh conditions. I was put in a barrack with I don't know how many people. There were 2 people to a bed, and felt very lonely at that point because some people knew others, had relatives and so on. I really felt abandoned. I tried to make contact. I didn't have any friends, any relatives. There was one man that knew my parents, and I tried to make contact with him. But he had his own problems, you know. So I basically searched for any form of that would link me to the past, even to the family. But there was nothing there. A few months in this terrible condition, I was deported from there to a German concentration camp to Germany. This was Gross-Rosen. I was approximately 4 days on this train. There were 500 of us deported from Krakow. We were on this train. We arrived to a little town in Germany called Gross-Rosen. I can describe only briefly as we stepped out of this train. There was a whitewashed railway station. There were flower pots at the windows. It was clean. The light from the sun was very bright. This was May 44. And I remember it took a little time for us to get used to the bright sunlight. We were told to march from the railway stations. We were surrounded by the guards, and we marched. And I remember what stuck into my mind was a sign. It said, Granitwerke Konzentrationslager Gross-Rosen, the quarry works of the concentration camp Gross-Rosen. We would probably walk for 45 minutes. All I remember is that, again, I could see the towers and the barbed wire and the gate open. And these weird-looking people in pyjama-striped uniforms were at the gate. Orchestra, playing one of these Viennese waltzes. That I can remember vividly. And again, I thought, this is weird and weird. And as we came in through that gate, we were assembled in a square again. And 5 minutes after this Viennese waltz greeting by these weird people that I have not seen before in pyjama-clad uniforms, we were assaulted by the SS and beaten up on this big square, which is called an Appellplatz in a concentration camp. Where it just so happens that I know today that we were the first 500 Jews that got into this camp that they had seen, the SS and others. There were no Jews in this camp at that time. This was 44. They did have some Jews, but there were many Germans and Poles and others and so on. Anyway, we got a beating after that. I'll never forget. Some people died. We were brutally assaulted now. All I remember is that I was very, very thirsty. After this beating, they finally let us get into a barrack. But before that, we had to be disinfected and get this striped uniform. So we had to take showers. So it's a disinfecting bath, you know. By then, we knew something about the showers and gas. There were rumors. I remember going down the steps, and I was very thirsty. As I was going down the steps, I was given a piece of bread. This was our ration for the night. And there were some attendants there. And I traded this piece of bread for a little water. I wanted water. We were very, very thirsty. So I gave this bread away. I got a little water. And we were walking down into those disinfecting things. I remember vividly looking to see at the shower heads if there were any sign of water, you know, or whether it was gas. Well, of course, it was water, all right. And then we went through this process. We got these uniforms that somebody just threw at you, you know, whether it fitted or not. It was secondary. I was put into this cloud uniform, went to the barrack, and after this ordeal, we got a lecture from the barrack leader, who was what they call barrack Ältester, or elder of the barrack, you know, how clean you have to maintain the beds, how they have to be made, and how straight, otherwise you'll be beaten up, and so on. And finally, we fell asleep, and I woke up next day in this camp. And the first thing I remember, we tried to find out if there are gas chambers there. And I remember that from the other inmates that we were told that yes, there is a gas chamber. You could see the smoke. You could see the chimney. Exactly. And we were told that people are taken there, and the rumor was in the camp that they are killed by injection. You know, what and how. Anyway, this was Gross-Rosen camp. It was a terrible place. It was just terrible. There were all kinds of weird people in there, you know, and you could tell by the insignia who they were, whether they were criminals or whether they were political prisoners and so on. But we were the 500 Jews in this initial group, where we stayed there for a few weeks, and then we were taken to a small sub-camp where we began to build tunnels. So apparently, the original intent of our transport from Krakow was to get us into Germany to work for us, to build these tunnels. And I began to work in this small camp. There were no barracks yet. We had to build our own barracks. But anyway, I was selected from the group of these 500 to be sent to the tunnels, to build these tunnels. We had no idea what the hell they're doing. I mean, what is going on? Of course, in retrospect today, I know what they were doing. But there were groups of 20 of us on shifts. And apparently, I must have looked in good physical shape, because I was selected, and we went on this shift. I was present in a night shift, 12-hour shift. We built these tunnels. So what they did, they were drilled holes in the mountain. They were dynamited, and we had to put these rocks and these on little metal wagons and get them out and build and so on and continue. Within a week, we were quite deep in. The problem was, every time we get into this shift, some of our colleagues would be taken out because these darn rocks would fall on their heads, because they were not the Germans were not concerned with putting supports. So I'll never forget it. You go into this shift, you come in, somebody is being carried out, you know. Anyway, I worked there for 8 months. The problem basically there was that they would let us get in there before the fumes would evaporate, so you would choke on this terrible dust and fumes from the previous thing, you know. And then the SS guards, and of course there was a lot of water there because it was wet, and sometimes they would hit an underground water table. Anyway, this is where I met this young man, Willie. Willie was my co-worker. He was my age, and he told me that he just came from Budapest. He looked quite all right. By just, it was about a month ago, he was still in Budapest. He was sent with his family to Auschwitz, and from Auschwitz to Gross-Rosen, and in Gross-Rosen he was sent there. And he and I were working together, and we were trying to get these rocks on these metal wagons to get them out. And every so often the rocks were so heavy, we couldn't lift those rocks, so we would take these picks and try to break a rock and get it out. So we would work together, and we would share the dreams sometimes, walk back to the camp. And he would tell me a little bit about his life, and I a little bit about mine. And I remember this young boy's face, and we became so attached, almost like a brother to me, you know. And I often wonder if he survived.
This sort of, as you're talking and smiling, I get such a sense of it being almost a pleasant memory.
Yes, there was a pleasant memory, because you had somebody you could share the moments of your life, you know. And I will never forget this young boy that I don't remember his last name even, you know. And I remember only Willie, you know, Willie from Budapest. That's all I remember. Well, as later on, as the camp was liquidated, there were dead marches. We were separated. And he went with a group that, as I know today, apparently was shot in the forest. And I was sent to Mauthausen. I had another 6 months of this misery, and from Mauthausen I was sent to Adamsay, which was its sub-camp. And I'll describe the last moments of, well, anyway, we're losing people right and left. I mean, people were just dying. And by then, most of the Jews were dead. I mean, my transport was probably decimated. We lost on the train, as we marched from Gross-Rosen to board a train. It took 2 weeks in this march, which I have no time really to describe, because we slept in these shacks, you know, in a vertical position that you couldn't even lay down. So anyway, we're losing people. And the SS would shoot anyone who just couldn't walk. And the reason these marches took place is because the Russian armies were approaching eastern Germany, and this was east part of Germany. So they evacuated us west. So so I was being evacuated to Austria, to Mauthausen. So we finally, after 2 weeks of marching, and this is where I was separated from Willie, we boarded a train on the Czech-German border. We got on this train and arrived in Mauthausen. In Mauthausen, we unloaded our deaths, people who died on the way, and half of the transport was dead. Well, this was terrible. All I remember is that the stiff bodies were taken out of the thing, and I didn't. You were cold. And I mean, emotionally, I don't know whether I had any feeling at that time. I just really cannot capture that feeling. All I can recall is that the train stopped on the way from Mauthausen to its sub-camp Ebensee, where I was liberated. It stopped close to the Danube on a bridge because the American planes were overhead. And this was the first sight that I had of American planes. They were hitting the bridges over the Danube and were bombing the area. There were some, as I know today, they were going to Vienna and so on. The train stopped, the SS guards got off, and I was sitting on this train looking there through that little window and seeing those planes and what a feeling that was. And I can tell you, and somebody asked me about it the other day, that I would not have mind to have a bomb hit me at the time as long as the SS guard would have gone with me. There was no fear. There was a feeling of exhilaration to see that the war is coming to an end, that there's hope. Now, I went back to see this railway station, that place, a few years ago. There was a place that is stuck in my memory. It's called Saint Valentin, SD, Saint Valentin. It's there, the railway station, exactly the way it was when I saw it, with the same clock that I could see the time of the day. And I saw it with my family a few years ago. Well, the train moved. We got into Ebensee. Well, the reception in Ebensee, which was part of Mauthausen, this was a death camp. The reception was terrible. We were again beaten up, put into a barrack. The windows were removed. January 45, temperatures below zero. All I can describe to you that I don't know how anyone survived that. Wooden shoes, pajama striped uniform, and tunnels again. We are building again tunnels. Now, these tunnels were already built. So I went in those tunnels. We were working in them, but they were built. There were trains going in there. What they had in these tunnels were they were assembling parts of their industry, armaments, the V-rockets or whatever. There were trains. They were huge. This is what these tunnels were, to protect them from being bombed. It looked like an inferno, these tunnels. These tunnels, those that we were working on there were never completed. These in Ebensee were already completed. Some of them were. They looked like out of fairy tale. Huge things in the mountains with trains going in and out, and we are working there, and madhouse. I mean, people running around, and water, and guards, and at any rate, I worked there for 5 months. People were dying daily. The process consisted of having a roll call in the morning, to go out in rows of 5, no food, hardly any rations. So people were dying of starvation. A month before liberation, one day in the barrack, I came back from a night shift, and the block leader says, I need volunteers who will get a soup to get these bodies into the crematorium. I and my friend volunteered to take a body. How do you carry a body? So we put this body in a blanket. We couldn't carry it, so we just put this body. We took the blanket from the bunk, and we just pull it. Finally, get into the crematorium. The crematorium was full of bodies. And the man, the capo in charge of the crematoria, says, you got to set this body like this. And these bodies were lined up like this for the sake of space, one in a row. Well, we finally got the body there, and we put it in there. We got back to the barrack, and we never got the soup. Obviously, it was just a deception, People were just starving. They were just dropping dead.
You had no food at all?
Hardly any. I was eating by that time charcoal. Ebensee at that time had incidents of cannibalism.
I'm sure.
The last 2 weeks, now, those were the moments where I felt that I possibly am not going to survive. I never knew how I'm going to be liberated. Those thoughts of what will happen to me prevailed in the last year and so on. What will be the feeling of death? Will it be a bullet? I just didn't know. But the last week in Ames, I felt I would just drop dead because of starvation. I started to get desperate. I the last week was bad. As I said, I was getting very, very weak. Thursday, which was May the 3rd, probably May 3rd or 2nd, we did not go out to work anymore. We knew something was happening, you know. The night shift didn't go out, which simply meant, you know, you don't go out to work, you know, that is the end of something or the beginning of something. By Saturday morning, the entire camp was assembled. All the inmates. There probably were 2,000 Jewish inmates left out of 18,000 approximately. We were all in the same barrack. We were assembled early in the morning. The camp commandant, the SS camp commandant, made an address to all of us. He said, I want you for your own safety to go to the tunnels because there's going to be a battle. The armies, American armies, are approaching and so on. That was translated in all the languages to the assembled people in the barracks. At the same time, the black leaders by then said, say you don't want to go. Now, normally this would be impossible to do. The square where we were assembled was surrounded by towers with machine guns, and the SS was still, under normal conditions, you were just decimated. Well, but anyway, they knew, some of the people knew more than we did. They said, don't go. And we said we're staying there either. This was Saturday morning. We were dismissed back to our barracks. Around maybe at noon, they changed the guards. The SS guards disappeared from the towers. Civilian guards appeared. We knew something was happening, obviously something good. We went back to the barracks. Sunday morning, it was a beautiful day. I'll never forget that day because it will be in my memory forever. Around 12, I approached the main gate of the concentration camp. People were milling around. A lot of people were in the barracks, could not get out of the bunks. They were too weak, too tired, too sickly to move. I had enough strength to move. I moved to the main gate, and there may have been 200-300 people there. I stood there at that gate. An SS-man approached the main gate, and he said, I need 4 people to come to do something. And he pointed a finger at me, and I walked with him. As we walked out of the main gate, there was a guardhouse to the right. The guardhouse where the SS used to count you as you came in and out of the camp. The guardhouse was full of weapons, machine guns, grenades, and so on. The SS-man told me and the other 3, he said, I want you to move this stuff in the back of this thing. We were working and moving this stuff out. I remember the clock in the guardhouse, a few minutes after 1. As I'm working and moving these guns and so on, I suddenly see a tank working its way up the hill. It was a tank with a white star on it. I had absolutely no idea exactly the white star made an American tank. The tank was slowly moving up, almost like in a cautious way. It made a right turn towards the main gate of the camp. I walked out of the guardhouse. The SS disappeared. I remember the tank stopping right in front of the gate. The gate opened. People started to move out in a frenzy. A man walked out of this tank, and I could tell it's an American, the uniform. He came out, and suddenly this humanity, and I was just standing right there, this humanity of these people who were on the other side of the gate just jumped upon this man. I don't know how he survived that. They started to kiss him, and he was just swept off his feet. I moved on with the others. There was a kitchen about 100 yards away, a kitchen used by the SS. I moved on. I was swept by this humanity into this SS kitchen. There was coffee there, and there was some food, and there was a side. People were putting their hands in this coffee and licking it. It was a madhouse. People would throw themselves on pieces of bread or whatever was left. Anyway, I moved back maybe within 10 minutes, and I still could see this tank and another tank coming behind him, and they were filming this scene. The gate was open, and there was already a banner on this gate. Long live liberty. Long live Austria. Apparently the civilians from the town, after all, Austria claimed it was occupied, of course, by the Nazis, so they put this banner, long live liberty. And this was my moment of liberation. And what can I tell you? Is that I was almost outside of the gate, seeing this scene of this American GI emerging from this tank, being swept by this humanity. Well, this was how the Holocaust ended for me. It was not really the end, because
but a note of joy.
The moment of joy. But the SS guards left, and a few minutes later I could still see some of them leaving. I was impotent to do anything. I was obviously in a moment of shock, of euphoria. But this was the moment. And this is what I wanted to share with you right now. And
do you want to also share something about your present life too, just to finish off?
Well, all I can say is that these events obviously they left an impact on me. They probably matured me. They probably made me a much more introspective human being. I would say that from the positive point of view, maybe a much more sensitive human being to the sufferings of others. I'm sure that they must have left some negative aspects, such as, although I may not be fully aware of them, I'm sure there's certain amounts of anxieties present, and which are probably triggered by certain things, which maybe would not have happened. But by and large, have matured me way too fast. I often feel that I had deprived me of the ability to learn more about my family, to learn more about who were my parents really, what kind of people were there. I never had a chance to get to know them, or to know them through the eyes of a mature person. And this is probably a loss that I feel greatly.
Cheated,
yes, because they were lost at the age of 44. They were 44 when they perished. And I was only 14, so I never really knew them through the eyes of a person who would have had a chance to see their parents go through the various stages up to the age of old, good age. And I felt cheated. I felt cheated to not have had my friends, my classmates. I lost the link to my past, which I miss very much. I built up a very nice life after the war. I have a wonderful family. But there is this missing link to the past. And as I search myself and history books and others to give me that insight of the past, in that search I felt the need for us to express this terrible experience and share it with you and many others, so that it is not forgotten and possibly will never happen.
Thank you.